What are the legacies of the 2003 US invasion and occupation of Iraq? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Sinan Antoon. This episode of Connections is co-sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and the Iraq 2023 20 Years On project. Sinan Antoon is an Iraqi poet, novelist, scholar, and translator, and has been described as one of the most acclaimed contemporary Arab writers. His work, which includes 4 novels, has won multiple awards. An associate professor at New York University, Sinan is a co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya. Sinan Antoon, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you so much, Mouin. The pleasure and honor is mine. It's wonderful to talk to you, even on such a sad subject and sad anniversary.
Thank you, Sinan. And perhaps then diving right in, I'd like to start with your personal recollections of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Where were you at the time, and how did you experience the war?
Yeah, I was a graduate student at the time, and I had gotten a research fellowship to work on my dissertation in Cairo because of the archives there. It was about an Iraqi poet from the 10th century. So I was in Cairo, but I was, of course, very concerned and worried about what was about to happen. And in the previous year, in 2002, when I was still in the US, I had already started speaking publicly and writing in English and Arabic in The Nation and at Safir and elsewhere against the war and warning of the catastrophic consequences. And actually, I must say, the American Friends Service Committee in 2002 organized a tour for a number of us speaking against the war, myself, an Afghani-American woman, a Hiroshima survivor, and 2 relatives of 9/11 victims, American citizens whose relatives died in 9/11. We were going around the East Coast saying why we were against the war. So in March, it sadly became obvious that it was inevitable, and I was in Cairo, and Cairo, like many cities, there were massive demonstrations and protests against the war. And for me, it was unique because I had, lived in Iraq for the first 23 years of my life under Saddam's dictatorship, where protests were always in support of something. So this was the first time for me to protest in an Arab city, in an Arab capital, against something. And it was unique because there was a lot of anger, and the anger, of course, was against the US and UK invasion, but days before it was against the complicity of the Egyptian regime as well as so many other regimes, because a lot of the American Navy submarines and the aircraft carriers came through Suez, through Egypt. And in those protests, it was in a way, I think, one of the seeds for the 2011 uprisings, because there were a lot of chants against the invasion, but there were a lot of chants against Hosni Mubarak, and his pictures and posters were torn. And of course, the regime had to allow these protests to go on for a few days, but then its own thugs started to destroy cars, and then under the guise of maintaining law and order, they said that there would be no protests. But that was an important moment. And then I, like millions, watched on TV, on satellite channels from Cairo, the beginning of the war and the horrendous shock and awe. And I also must say that having lived through the 1991 bombing in Baghdad in 1991, the US's first attack on Iraq and massive destruction of infrastructure. For us in Baghdad at the time, there was no electricity because of the bombing, and we followed the news through radios. Mm-hmm. So then when I left and came to the US, I watched some of the footage and realized and read later that this was the first TV war where, by and large, the world saw the war from the perspective of the bombers. Of course,
live, in fact.
Yeah, with the cameras on the bottom, but also watch the discourse and the rhetoric of some of those who participated in the bombing. So one of the pilots who had just come back from bombing Baghdad said it was tremendous, quote, it lit up like a Christmas tree.
Mhm.
And simultaneously, of course, I heard a lot of Iraqis in the diaspora and Arabs saying how painful it was and paralyzing to watch Baghdad being bombed. And at the time, I was slightly dismissive of that because, of course, I thought, we were experiencing it firsthand. But in Cairo in 2003, I came to understand what different type of melancholy and sadness there is, of course, to watch your hometown, the city that you grew up in, being bombed with missiles, and at the same time listen to the way the media, by and large, with a few exceptions, were just parroting the official line in pure old propaganda. But also I remember Donald Rumsfeld, for example, when asked about the weapons, he waxed poetic about the humanity that has gone into making these weapons. So not that I was not aware of it, but frankly, the barbarism of the American empire was out in full force. And the corporate media was doing its job very well, to quote Chomsky, in manufacturing consent. And so it was quite horrific. And some of our colleagues who are now part of Jadaliyya, we were so frustrated with the way also Iraq and its history and the complex relationship of the US to Iraq in terms of supporting Saddam Hussein, supporting his regime, was completely erased, and Iraq was trivialized. So
Rumsfeld being a prominent example.
Yes. So we right away, 3 months after that, we went to Baghdad.
Yes, I was going to ask you, because you went with several of our current Jadaliyya colleagues to Baghdad to make a documentary about Baghdad.
Yeah, because throughout the run-up to the war and the crescendo of the war drums, I mean, I wrote about this. I mean, there are statistics that in the few weeks before the war, out of 270 interviews, there was one person who was questioning the war.
Mm-hmm.
And, Iraqis were simplified into this binary. Either, they are supporters of Saddam or they hate Saddam, so they will welcome the United States with roses and sweets. And if you ever heard or read anything by an Iraqi in mainstream media, it would be one of those neocons that we know who they are. So sadly, Bassam, Maya, Susie, Adam, and myself, the collective, our whole approach and objective was to represent something which should be common sense, is that Iraqis, like other human beings, are complicated human beings who hold different positions and are not all either pro-US or against the US, and also to show the complexity and what the sanctions had already done to Iraqi society, and to listen to Iraqis themselves who will live the consequences of the war, not people living abroad. Tell us what they think of Saddam Hussein, what they think of the US coming, what do they remember. And the film will be relaunched in a few weeks at Georgetown and will be available to the public, which I'm very happy to.
That's great. You mentioned the sanctions, and you mentioned U.S. support for Saddam during the 1980s, and you also mentioned that you were in Baghdad during the 1991 war. So particularly given that you also had the opportunity to visit Iraq for the first time after many years in 2003, what I'd like to ask you is that before 2003, Iraq, of course, had been through an 8-year war with Iran during the 1980s. Then there was a 1991 Kuwait war. This was followed by a decade of devastating sanctions against Iraq. Given all this background and context, what in your view was exceptional about the 2003 war and the subsequent occupation?
I mean, I oftentimes say 2003 is Act 3 in a way in the American destruction of Iraq. Because as you mentioned, the Iraq-Iran war was very costly in human lives and in dollars to Iraq, and hurt Iraq's economy, and had this army, become really huge and caused a lot of problems that, of course, Saddam unfortunately thought he would solve by invading Kuwait. But I should say that until 1991, that was the first blow, because sadly, to quote James Baker again, he said, we bombed them back to the pre-industrial age. So the infrastructure of Iraq, yes, the infrastructure of Iraq was very advanced, but 1991, it was also 114 bridges, for example, were destroyed. And so much unnecessarily was destroyed that didn't involve ejecting Iraq out of Kuwait. And then the sanctions also were another form of warfare, and a silent war, as Joy Gordon says. But 2003 involved the dismantling of the Iraqi state, dismantling of the Iraqi army, dismantling of the Iraqi police, and the installing this ethno-sectarian system in its place, but also bringing in mostly diaspora professional politicians from Tehran, from London, from the US, from elsewhere, most of whom had no credibility inside Iraq. Most of them had very sectarian views already that had kind of developed in their political ghettos that they were living in. Some of them were actual crooks, and we know that, and we don't have to go into detail. But in the last few years, as talk of corruption increases, it dawned on me, although just some of these people had never, ever managed anything really, never managed any institution or a group of people in their life, to bring them in and put them in charge of a very large, very complicated country. And the other thing about imperial hubris and madness is to think we'll take apart a nation, a state that has been in being built for 90, 95, 100 years, and then we'll somehow, this other notion of nation building with crooks, with wanted people who were wanted for economic sabotage, and people who were mostly beholden to Saudi, Iranian, American, and British intelligence. But the most devastating thing was to actually institutionalize sectarianism.
And if I can just interrupt, Sinan, we've discussed this before, that you make the point that irrespective of any sectarian realities in Iraq prior to 2003, it was formalized and institutionalized after that by the Americans in their first governing structure, the Coalition Provision Authority.
Actually, we happened to be in Baghdad. We were still filming in Baghdad. And I remember when they announced the formation of this governing council, they had put the sect of each person that they chose next to them. And of course, Paul Bremer, the ruler of Iraq, was told, you have to include the Communist Party, because the Communist Party had constituency inside Iraq, despite all the violence against it by the Saddam regime, but also because this is important. But of course, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, his entry to this list was because he was a Shi'i put next. And I remember a lot of people on the street saying, why are they putting these categories? Now, I'm not saying this to say that there are no sectarian tensions, but sect was not a political category. And something that has yet to be researched and studied and understood is this, epistemic violence, this creation of new political identities and institutions that then come to be filled by these people and internalized by the public. And of course, then most of the parties that came from abroad were sectarian based, and then they start to share the pie of Iraq, and they all have their own media outlets. With the chaos of the post-2003, which some people think is freedom, they start to spew this sectarian discourse. But thankfully, despite these, 2 decades of this type of epistemic violence, the 2019 uprising showed also that the younger generation was no longer buying all of this. But maybe that's something we can talk about later.
Yeah, and I wouldn't.
I just want to mention one example that I think would be useful. That the US had this deck of cards for the 52 most important pillars of the Iraqi regime.
The 52 most wanted.
Yeah. Yes, to debunk this notion of the Sunni regime. Even yesterday, the New York Times was still talking about the Sunni regime.
Of Saddam Hussein.
a significant number of the people included in that deck of cards were not Sunnis. And then the notion that somehow Arabs or Muslims or Iraqis are incapable of, holding an ideology that does not correspond to their sect is racist, if not ignorant.
No. But again, you mentioned 2019 and the uprising by Iraqi youth during that time. But before turning to that, looking back now, 20 years after the fact, what would you describe as the most important legacies of the war and occupation upon Iraq and its society? You've mentioned sectarianism, but more broadly.
Destroying all the structures that were there, destroying the sense of there is no protection for citizens in society anymore. Dismantling the army, dismantling the police. The country had no sovereignty. So the most important legacy is terrorism, actually. In that what happened to Iraqis after 2003 is that Iraq became an open theater for the so-called war on terror. So we did not have Al-Qaeda before 2003, but thanks to the US occupation, we have Al-Qaeda, we had suicide bombings, we had massive violence against Iraqis every day. And that did not exist before. So one of the responsibilities of an occupying army, supposedly, is to provide safety and order in the territory that it occupies. And when my colleagues and I, in filming about Baghdad, when Bassam and I were entering Iraq from Jordan, the main endpoint from Jordan to Iraq, there were 3 American soldiers. That's it. And I remember us talking about what a catastrophe it is, because that meant that the borders of Iraq were completely open for whoever wanted or had a gripe with the United States to go to Iraq, whoever had espoused whatever kind of mentality and wanted to kill Shiis can go to Iraq. And Bush, the prime war criminal himself, said, well, we'll fight them over there so that we don't have to fight over here. So the main effect is turning Iraq from a country under dictatorship into an open war zone where there are no maps for citizens. As someone told me, I don't know what to do to stay alive back then, because under dictatorship, you know what the red lines are, you know what to do in order to stay alive. But in post-2003 Iraq, with all of the violence, with ISIS, with before that, Al-Qaeda, people don't know. Going out in public was a major risk.
Yeah, but then, so you had from 2003 onwards, the disintegration of the destruction of the Iraqi state, let's call it the disintegration of Iraqi society, civil war, effectively, a sectarian conflict within Iraq. But then also more recently, and of course, you had the emergence of the Islamic State movement and Al-Qaeda and these other factors that you've discussed. And then several years ago, you began to see, I think, signs of real hope with the youth uprising in 2019. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I mean, I think the economic situation was increasingly horrendous for large sectors of Iraqi society, coupled with the obscene wealth of the oligarchy and the ruling class. The gap between those two was unbelievable. And also, I think most Iraqis began to realize that this sectarian discourse was just a ploy. I mean, one of the slogans of the uprising was that in the name of religion, the thieves have swindled us. So increasingly large numbers of Iraqis realized that sectarianism was just a ploy to exploit the country, exploit its economy, and keep ruling. So there had been, way back even in 2011, I mean, you know, in the research and the studies about the Arab uprising, the focus is always on Egypt and Tunisia, largely, and on Syria. But there was also, I remember very well in 2011, there were protests in Iraq. And later there were protests against corruption. And they grew. And I think in 2019, it was the climax. Also, the crackdown by the regime and its anti-riot police, but also how especially after ISIS was defeated. I mean, the rise of ISIS is itself an indication of what post-2003 Iraq was, is that it did not have a functioning army that can defend its citizens. So the popular mobilization units were formed in order to liberate these cities and defeat ISIS. And by and large, they were formed by their rank and file were, poor working class people, especially from everywhere, but especially from the southern provinces that are predominantly Shiites. And then after that, they come back to an economy in shambles, and they realize that that also the frustration of how also the victories against ISIS and this popular mobilization unit itself becomes a political force and starts to, their leaders become war merchants. All of that together, I think, compelled so many Iraqi youth also who were really sick and tired of having to live in such a terrible economy in theoretically one of the richest countries in the world. So there were protests, and the protests mushroomed. And what was really great is that they were joined. It was initially impoverished working class Iraqis in Baghdad, but later I think other sectors joined, and it was very peaceful, and it withstood the violence of the regime. But sadly, even in this instance, the assassination of Soleimani under Trump ended up polarizing and kind of dividing the uprising and turning into something about Iran or the US. But one of the early slogans that was hung on a banner in Tahrir Square in Baghdad was "No to America and no to Iran." So there was this recognition that we want a country with sovereignty, we want our country back, we want a healthy economy, we don't want to be beholden to foreigners and other countries.
If we look at the legacy of the war and its impact, I think there are two other issues we also need to discuss. The first is the extraordinary level of displacement of Iraqis, whether internally within Iraq or people who became refugees abroad. This, of course, started during the 90s as people were seeking to escape the devastating impact of the sanctions and the Iraqi government's repression, but it really took off exponentially after 2003.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the latest figure I read is that the total of Iraqis who were displaced and had to leave their homes was 8 million. I mean, this is a catastrophic number. And, there are maps out there about what the lack of security and turning Iraq into a theater of the war on terror, what that did to so many Iraqis. Ethnic cleansing took place because of the occupation. And now the other thing that the US introduced is this notion of mixed areas, as if, most of the areas were mixed areas. Like every place in the world, like every city, there are certain neighborhoods that are predominantly this or that group, but introducing the notion of mixed areas is as if there weren't mixed areas before. But the institutionalization of ethno-sectarianism, the lack of safety, and also I forgot to mention one prime example is the first few weeks of the occupation, the US allowed the Badr militia, the Badr brigades, which were
This is a pro-Iranian Shia militia, I believe.
Yeah, they are the military wing of the so-called, this used to be called the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution,
which was based in Iran during the Saddam years.
Yeah. And they come with their weapons in the first few weeks of the occupation, and they begin, of course, all these assassination campaigns and all types of violence. But so many people had to leave their houses and move to other neighborhoods and be displaced. And as you mentioned, also, a lot of people started to leave the country because it was unlivable. And that continued even more after ISIS. So now we have 1.2 million people are internally displaced, and most of them live in camps. And it says something about how corrupt this government is, that despite all the resources that they have, until today, they have not really rebuilt the destroyed cities because of the war with ISIS, nor allowed these Iraqis to come back.
Mm.
And we have, I think it's now 4.5 or 5 million Iraqis living outside of Iraq, which is a huge percentage, which, as you said, started out in the 90s, but increased after 2003.
And it's also a huge drain on Iraq's most valuable resource, its human capital.
Of course.
Another issue that's, of course, come to the fore during the past 20 years is the role of the Kurds within Iraq, and whether they will enjoy genuine autonomy, seek secession and independence, and so on. How has the last 20 years affected the Kurdish question in Iraq?
I mean, I should start by saying that throughout the last 20 years, but especially in the first 10 years, we'd often read these stories in European and American media that tell us what a success story Kurdistan is, without telling us why. You know, one would get the feeling that it's, you know, because of whatever. But something that's important to remember is that already from 1991, that region already had semi-autonomy in a way because of what had happened. Yes. And also, while that region suffered, it did not suffer the consequences of the sanctions the way the rest of Iraq did. And in 2003, it did not suffer the chaos that the rest of Iraq suffered, because there were already these two dominant parties and the two dominant regions, which were kind of sharing power there. And irrespective of what I think of the rights of Iraqi Kurds to decide their future, and I agree with that, but in the last few years, we discovered that some of the same problems that plague the rest of Iraq are also plaguing Kurdistan in terms of the massive corruption, and how these two parties are just, two ruling families. I mean, if you look just at the names of the prime ministers, I mean, once I wrote a tweet saying, there is democracy in Kurdistan, in Iraq. Anyone can become president or prime minister, and there is just one condition, that their last name is Talabani and last name is Barzani. And people got upset by that, but I'm only saying that because it's so horrendous and so blatant. And if you speak of the freedom of press, there have been numerous cases of journalists being kidnapped and journalists being tortured or killed just for pointing out the massive corruption of the two ruling families and who stands for them. In the last so-called crisis of migration and fleeing the area, or a significant number of them were from Kurdistan, Iraq, because young people there also have no hope. So this is how you see that, even in this happy story about Kurdistan is not such a happy story. And this, national aspiration and the right for self-determination is one thing, but just like the sectarian parties in the rest of Iraq use sect and histories of suffering to maintain their wealth and maintain the oligarchy, the two Kurdish parties use Kurdish nationalism and use the history and the actual suffering of Kurds who suffered under Saddam Hussein and other regimes to maintain their power. It's very sad, of course.
Sinan, I'd now like to turn to more international aspects of the war, even though, of course, we have been discussing the impact of foreign forces on Iraq throughout this discussion. But if we look at the situation in the US, the Iraq War is remembered today in the US primarily for the mendacity of its leaders and officials and the complicity of the media and US elites in promoting this war. And examples, of course, are too numerous to mention, although you've referred to a few of them. What are your reflections on this aspect of the Iraq War?
I mean, I agree with that, but I think, frankly, for those who care and want to understand, we have to dig a little bit deeper as to why was it so easy to sell the war to so many Americans, and why was there a consensus, left and right, Republican and Democrats, about going to Iraq, despite everything that we knew? And why is it that for many years, people were still telling happy stories? And that even many of those who initially and later were against the war, were not against the war for moral or ethical reasons, but use this, discourse of, oh, well, we didn't have the information and we shouldn't have been there because it's too complicated because of Islam, as if the notion is that actually you can have good colonialism, you just need good information. As if had there been planning for 3 years and really clear maps, everything would have gone. But I think there are several factors. I don't think we can discount the issue of oil. I remember Bush early on in his speech, it's an interesting aside, telling Iraqi soldiers, don't torch the oil wells. Of course, the reference was that in 1991, when the Iraqi army was forced to leave Kuwait, Saddam issued this horrible order about torching the oil wells of Kuwait, which of course cost the Iraqis billions of dollars because Iraq had to pay for all of that for years and years.
Until I think just a year or two ago.
Exactly. And so for Bush to say that, and we know where the Bush family comes from, so we cannot discount oil and the geopolitical aspects of all of this. And the notion, not that that's the only reason, I think there are several reasons. There are the messianism of George Bush. Those of us who are old enough to remember that he thought that he had some kind of mandate from God, I mean,
he was doing God's work.
Exactly, doing God's work. Then there were the neocons who, wanted to remake the Middle East and make it really safe for Israel. And that's an aspect too. Eliminating Iraq as a potential rival, taking Iraq out of the regional map, completely defanging Iraq. And those are the very same people who today complain about Iran having too much power in Iraq. Well, they made Iraq so weak that it became a playground for Iran. But also, I want to say is this, colonial mentality that is so embedded in the minds of many Americans that they think somehow that, quote, our boys and girls just go abroad and do good things. And also the sense of vengeance and imperial hubris. I mean, I will never stop mentioning this until the day I die, but Thomas Friedman, who writes for the New York Times and who's read
still
widely,
writes for the New York Times.
Yes, still writes for the New York Times and is read widely by Americans and by people abroad and is translated into Arabic. When asked on Charlie Rose, why did we go to Iraq? And Thomas Friedman is not very smart, but maybe that's why he was so honest. He said, we could have gone to Saudi Arabia. We could have gone to Pakistan, but we went to Iraq because we could. And because after 9/11, it was important to set the balance right. And he said, quote, so our boys and girls, his boys and girls, go house to house from Basra to Baghdad to tell everyone who doesn't understand, stuck on this. This is the level, this is the cowboy mentality that you find variations of everywhere. And it's supported by a lot of evidence in that. Also in the first few months of the war, I was watching a report on TV, and this notion of embedded journalism is so sinister. I mean, the Pentagon learned the lesson story of Vietnam, so that from 91 and in 2003, you have a complicit, compliant propaganda media. And all the journalists are with the soldiers. And later I want to talk about how there is embedded scholarship and even embedded film and poetry. But when I was watching, there was an American journalist with a group of US soldiers in a Humvee exiting a base near Baghdad, occupied base. And the soldier turns and tells the journalist, this is Indian territory. Now, a responsible citizen, a responsible journalist would ask the soldier, what do you mean by this? But he didn't, because the notion of Indian territory is embedded in the American imaginary, of course.
It was a common concept for yes, both of them. Yeah.
It's used unofficially in the US Army to refer to Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. But it invokes this image of, the frontier of the West and our boys and girls spreading civilization. And it was mentioned later by Brian Williams and others. And this is at the heart of how I, throughout those 20 years, were asked by many people, so we didn't do anything good in Iraq. I mean, why would you think that an occupying army would do anything good in Iraq? Maybe it's not just white supremacy. It's this notion that Americans have of liberating France, as if that's, that is one experience that has to do with the context at the time. But what the US Army does abroad is not liberate people usually. What the military bases do around the world, which most citizens don't know about, is not support democracy. It's actually the opposite.
And you're basically, I think, making the argument that given the nature of this war, nothing good can come out of something born in sin.
Of course, definitely. And I must say, I have to point out that, as I said, the support for the war continued despite all the indications on the ground that it was catastrophic. And we should remember that Bush was reelected despite all the catastrophes. And it's also, speaking of the legacy, to go back, the legacy of the war for many is Abu Ghraib, the torture. This is also something that's our boys and girls, something that they used to do here and still can do abroad. And the legacy that will stay on is the destruction of the health and bodies of Iraqis from the use of depleted uranium. Sorry to bring it back to something that's not strictly international, but it is international. In that 1991, the US uses depleted uranium in Iraq, and it causes cancer rates to skyrocket, especially in southern Iraq. And then it uses it again in 2003, and it uses
primarily
Fallujah. And in Fallujah now, we have the most horrendous birth defects that people are born with every day. That's the legacy of the US occupation.
Well, given this legacy, my final issue I'd like to discuss with you is accountability. As you know, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, recently indicted Russian President Vladimir Putin for crimes committed against Ukraine. And of course, the court was widely celebrated in the US and UK for doing so. Yet there's been no accountability in either country, in either the US or the UK, for the crimes committed by their officials in and against Iraq. What are your thoughts about accountability? And here I'd just like to remind our viewers that Sinan yesterday published a very powerful opinion piece in The Guardian entitled "A Million Lives Later, I Cannot Forgive What American Terrorism Did to My Country, Iraq."
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is, it's difficult not to be cynical, but this is the so-called rule-based world that we live in, where there are at least two, if not three sets of rules. So the people who lobbied to put Putin in that category, and the people who wrote in support, most of them were supportive of American crimes in Iraq and of the American war in Iraq. And so we live in a country that has a lot of war criminals, and they go around appearing on TV shows, dancing and smiling and laughing, and they're never even questioned. I mean, I'll give credit to American citizens that oftentimes if Condoleezza Rice is speaking somewhere, someone stands up and takes her to task for what she did, or do that to Hillary Clinton or others. But there are plenty of war criminals. But of course, there is this hierarchy of human worth, and who's a really full human being and whose life or death doesn't matter, right? The same argument, of course, can be applied to Palestine and Israel. So that's how I feel. Of course, yes, Putin is a war criminal, but there are so many war criminals who are American and British, but they'll never be tried. I don't think so. Not in the type of world that we live in, which not only overlooks crimes committed against brown people, but celebrates them. I mean, until today, yesterday, the headline in a piece in the New York Times was, Iraq is not a hopeful place, but it's freer And this, the concept of freedom has been completely denigrated, of course. It always has, but especially in the last 20 years, Bush claimed I made 40 million people more free. I mean, how do you measure freedom? Freedom is the freedom to be killed by anyone. And even Hans Blix yesterday, Hans Blix was the chief of
Weapons
the UN
inspector. Yeah.
Weapons inspectors, who conducted 700 inspections and didn't find anything. Yet we're still told, oh, it was faulty information. He said yesterday, dictatorship, now Iraq has anarchy. And you go tell people, anarchy is better than dictatorship. Of course, the problem in this discourse from 2002 is that if you question the US war and the US invasion, you're labeled as a supporter, or it's as if you want the dictator to stay there forever. And I should mention that more than 350 Iraqis in the diaspora, many of whom victims of Saddam's oppression, signed a petition, and I was proud to have been one of them, saying no to dictatorship, no to war, and warning that an invasion of Iraq will set off all kinds of destruction in so many directions.
And that's precisely what happened. And that's also, I think, one reason that Hans Blix, in that same interview, said he felt there was a compelling case to indict both Bush and Blair for war crimes.
Definitely, no question about it. And I just want to add that, sadly, the issue of weapons of mass destruction and Bush's Freudian slips becomes the joke. And people laugh because they have no shame, and because the destruction of other countries becomes just a joke. That's something that people should think about, irrespective of if you care or not about Iraqis. But what kind of people, what kind of human beings laugh at, they're laughing at themselves, actually, because the very same person who headed a government that lied to them and spent billions of their tax dollars waging a war, and all of these people whose portfolio is tripled. That's the other thing that people don't know in saying we. There is no such thing as we, of course. There are people who paid the price of the war, and most of the people who lobbied for the war and who planned the war are living a very good life, and they still have their jobs, and they're getting richer and richer, because there's the other aspect of the military-industrial complex. That's why there are people who are very happy about the Ukraine war and would want it to last a very long time, because the factories are churning out and the stocks are up, and war is good business for some people.
And rather than being held accountable, those responsible, as you point out, have actually profited from the illegality. Sinan Antoon, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with Connections on the very unfortunate commemoration of 20 years since the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. It was a real pleasure to speak with you.
The pleasure was mine, Mouin. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the great work you do. And I'm really delighted and honored. And hopefully, when we meet for the 30th anniversary, things will be slightly different if we're still here.
We'll hope and plan on it. Thank you again, Sinan.
Thank you, Azizi.